Adventures in Higher Education, John Marka Kinga.
Thank you. Before I put my presentation up, please note the changes in the schedule if you haven't already. The room in here, this room right here at 2 o'clock, we have a different presentation than what's on the schedule. And then on the schedule, if it says 105, it means 106. And if it says 103, it means 104. It's an intelligence test to see if you can find your way around our gathering. I apologize for that. All right, I think I want to turn this a little bit so that I can stand. It is true, this is the end of my time in St. Petersburg, the end of my time in Russia. Unfortunately, as Tatiana said, there will not be an English language fellow in St. Petersburg next year. However, the fellow in Moscow, who is actually here today, Tony Hull, is right, standing up with the camera. She will, of course, continue her duties in the Moscow region, but she will, I hope, have more than one opportunity to come to St. Petersburg. And so if you want her to visit, or if you want to plan a trip for next, especially like next fall, you can speak with her today about that. So I've had a very unique opportunity to live and work and teach in this wonderful, incredibly historic and amazing city that I just feel so incredibly fortunate to have had the opportunity to get to know, and to work at a university with enormously talented students and instructors. But it hasn't been easy. And I want to talk about some of the challenges that I faced simply because I am an outsider coming in. And I know that the topic or the theme of our gathering is bridging cultures. And I know the first SPELTA conference that I presented at, if I'm not mistaken, I spoke about helping students to become successful intercultural communicators. Because, you know, the future of English language, as far as English language speakers in the world, we don't really know who our students are going to be speaking with. It might be a native speaker, it might not be a native speaker. And learners need to kind of develop skills of adaptability, skills of reflection, so that they can perform at a high level in a wide variety of situations. And there's something that I say in that presentation that I want to repeat here because it's relevant for me. When we're talking about culture, we can say, for example, that when Americans eat, they use forks. And we can say that when Japanese eat, they use chopsticks. You know, that's interesting. It doesn't really say very much, though. What's really fascinating is what happens the first time an American visits a Japanese home for dinner. What kind of expectations are there? What kinds of communication problems are there? And this, in very many ways, this was my experience working in Russia. I was visiting a new culture, visiting a new teaching environment, and I was bringing with it my own background, my own understanding of what higher education means in the United States. And I was applying that to my time here, which caused a lot of very interesting and comical situations from time to time that I want to talk about today. So what I'm going to talk about, my goals, I want to, before I kind of talk about my experience here, I want to give you just a brief overview of higher education in the United States. If you're already familiar with the system of higher education in the U.S., I apologize. I get the feeling, though, that there will be some new information. And I want to share my experience working in Russia and some of the challenges that I encountered. Not just working at my host institution, but traveling around the region. I've visited about 15 or 16 different cities in and outside of the region. I've visited with hundreds and hundreds of students, probably thousands, and I've worked with English teachers in all of these locations. And after almost 2 years, I kind of feel like maybe I'm beginning to get to know Russia a little bit. It's hard to get to know her, but I feel like I'm starting. Unfortunately, it's right at the end when I'm about to leave. One thing that's really important that I want to say, I'm giving you my perspective of my experience here. My task is not to judge or evaluate the system of higher education. I'm not qualified to do that, and so I'm not even going to try to do that. But I will give you my impressions, my experience, based on the work that I've done. So the first thing, what does higher education look like in the U.S.? Well, of Americans, about 80% finish high school. It means 20% of Americans do not finish high school. Okay? And 21% have attended some college classes, some university classes. I know I make a better door than a window. I'm sorry, I'm standing right in front of you here. I'll try and move around a bit. Only about 15% have completed a 4-year education, and 9% have graduate degrees. This means that the majority of Americans do not have a university education. And I know that's very different than the situation here. My understanding that in the Russian Federation the number is around 50%, it may be even higher. So that's a really big difference. And if you want a degree, there are actually lots of different pathways in the United States. You can take a high school equivalency examination if you did not finish high school. This is actually what I did. I did not finish high school myself. Community colleges, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, which are small 2-year colleges that you attend. They're usually near your home. They're cheaper. They have open admission. You can transfer to a state university. Part-time study, evening classes, online degrees, student loans I'll talk about a little bit. Scholarships are a possibility, and work-study programs where you get your tuition paid for if you do some work in the community or in the city at large. And so for Americans, there are actually several different pathways to getting a degree. You can do it pretty much in as much or as little time as you want, and in a lot of different capacities. If you want to get into college, you take an examination, and these are like pseudo-privately run examinations. For example, the SAT is what most students take to get into college, into a university. I myself did not take it. It is not a requirement. It is run by a consortium of different universities, so it works as a non-profit organization, but you do have to pay. So it's kind of like a private company that administers the test. It is not a governmental test at all. Many Americans apply to different universities, apply for different kinds of scholarships, for example, academic scholarships or athletic scholarships. They will visit the university with their parents, or most community colleges have open admission. You don't necessarily have to apply or wait for an acceptance letter, as long as you finish high school. Now, the concept of the bachelor's degree: 2 years of general education and 2 years of specialized education. And so students are generally in class about 12 to 15 hours per week. They're expected, for every 1 hour in class, they're expected to do about 1 hour of homework. And so total schoolwork, as far as related to their studies, is no more than about 24 to 30 hours per week. This means that the remainder of the time, students are expected to work, or participate in athletics, or participate in clubs. So being a student is not considered a full-time job for most Americans. They should have time for other things. I myself, I worked 2 jobs when I was a college student. I don't recommend it, but I had no choice. And these first 2 years, so the 2 years of general education, you kind of have your own choice. You look at the schedule, and you look at your work schedule, for example, and you choose the courses that you want to take. And there are certain requirements. You don't have to, there's not like a list of courses everybody must take. You get to choose. You can take art courses, but if you want to take drawing or painting, that kind of thing, you get to choose. Everybody must take, for example, 1 or 2 literature courses, but you can study any kind of literature you want. You can study world literature, you can study Russian, American, British. 2 years of a foreign language. Unfortunately, that is generally the only requirement. But you get to choose the foreign language. And things like science, mathematics, history, etc., etc. But these first 2 years, you have a requirement of different types of courses, but you get to choose them yourself. So you choose your own schedule, and there's a quota that you must meet for each semester. For example, the number of classroom hours, 12 to 15, like I said, in general. You must have a certain number of hours in certain types of classes, like a certain number of hours in a writing course or a history course. And then once you've completed this process, these first 2 years, then you do what's called declare your major, and you move to the department that will be your specialization. Now, ideally, this happens after 2 years, but it doesn't have to. In fact, it can happen anytime. I had some classmates who had been in college for 5 years and still had not decided on their major. They were just taking courses. In the second 2 years, then you take a required set of courses. Generally, you stay like in one department or in one building for your second 2 years. And let's say if you're studying journalism, you know, for 2 years at the beginning, you were taking courses with everybody. You were in there with football players, and you were in there with biologists. But your second 2 years, you're in the journalism department, and you're taking primarily journalism courses. And then when it's done, you complete that, you have your degree. Generally, graduate studies are not done immediately. Most commonly, a graduate will complete his studies, maybe work for a little while, sometimes travel for a little while, and then decide on graduate studies later, almost always at a different university. No yearly examinations in bachelor's programs, generally speaking. No examinations whatsoever. No final project, no final examination, generally speaking. Every program is different, but generally speaking. So your advancement through the courses is determined by your marks in individual courses. So it's like you're just collecting grades, and at the end of 4 years, if you have enough, you graduate. Right? So progression through your program is determined by, you know, your own desire for how quickly you want to do it and what courses you want to take. There's no need to stay with a group of students. There's no need to take an examination at the end of the year. So your performance in the individual course is what's most important. So that means your professor is the gatekeeper. So if I'm your teacher, if you want to graduate, you must do well in my class. It is a requirement. If you don't, and of course, since we're choosing our own schedules in every single course, you have a different group of students. Right? Grades are given on a 5-point scale, A, B, C, D, and F. D is considered the lowest passing grade. An A is 90s, a B is 80s and 70s, 60s. Anything 59 or below is considered failing, and Fs are not uncommon. Most undergraduate programs require that you have a C average, and then you determine your overall grade point average by giving each letter grade a numerical grade, and then you get the average. So an A is worth 4 points, and an F is worth 0 points. So for example, a 4.0 is all A's, and a 3.8 is mostly A's, maybe 1 B. And generally, Americans put their grade point average on their resume. Paying for college at a public university. Now keep in mind that there's a wide variety of different options. These are current averages. But for 1 year of tuition at a public university, right now it's about $8,000. Private university, $28,000. And community colleges, much cheaper. You can see why community colleges are very popular. I myself went to a community college. I myself taught at a community college. But if you're from out of state, since most institutions they receive tax money from the state, if you're not a resident of that state and you come from another state, you have to pay extra to make up for the difference. Student loans, however, are available, and if you are a resident of the United States, they are relatively easy to get, and they have low interest rate, regulated by the federal government, and you can even defer payment if you lose your job, and the interest rate is fixed. I myself have quite a lot of student loans that I'm paying back, but maybe in about 30 years I'll have my education paid for. So most, like I said, generally graduate studies and bachelor's degree are not at the same university. And advanced degrees are pretty rare. Like you saw the numbers, 9% of Americans attend graduate school. But as economic times are difficult, and as more and more people attend graduate school, for many fields, a graduate degree is pretty much considered a requirement. When, for example, my parents were college age, it was a guarantee that if you had a 4-year degree, you would immediately have a job after you graduated, for the most part. Graduate programs require a B average in your bachelor's program just to qualify for the graduate program. And oftentimes, in graduate programs you find professionals who have decided to either continue their education or maybe even change their career. And so it's rare for a graduate studies classroom to have only 21, 22-year-olds. Generally, you'll see people in their 30s, 40s, even older, completing their graduate degree. And grades are not as important, marks are not as important as simply completing the work. All right, so my personal experience in higher education in the United States. I dropped out of high school. I did not finish high school. You may be aware that in general, American public schools, K through 12, are not that great. Now, if you live in a rich state, in a rich city, then maybe you have some really good teachers, you have a good administration. But I am from the South. I'm from Alabama, which is one of the poorest states in the Union. And my public education, K through 9, was very, very poor. And so I left high school. Well, my parents actually took me out of high school, and I was homeschooled. Through a church, my parents were able, even though we're not religious, my parents were able to get a certification to teach me at home for the rest of my high school years. So for 2 years after the 9th grade, my mother was my teacher. I didn't much enjoy that. You know, you can manipulate your mother, I think, a little bit easier than you can manipulate a teacher. But I was glad when it was over. At the end of 2 years, I took a high school equivalency examination. It's really easy. It's designed to be easy so that you can qualify for university classes. And so I took it and I got my high school equivalency certificate at the age of 17. Then I went to my local community college for 2 years where it was cheap, where they had open admission. I studied there for 2 years. I studied really, really hard. And at the end of 2 years, I transferred to a state university. And even though I spent half of my time at a community college when I received my degree, it was from the state university. So nowhere on my diploma does it say 2 years at a community college. It doesn't say that. It just says the University of Alabama. And I was in an interesting program where I got to design my own degree. And so I chose courses from different departments, and I made up a new degree called Literature and Creative Writing. So I took courses in the literature department and courses in the writing department and made my own degree. I know, crazy. Then I worked for 5 years as a journalist and as a teacher. I wrote for a newspaper for 4 years, decided I didn't like it at all. Then I became a teacher and decided I really did like teaching. And so, like I told you, traditionally what happens is we go to work and then decide on graduate studies. And I spent 2 years at a private university master's program. I'm in Washington, D.C. This is where I got my master's degree in teaching English to speakers of other languages. And then before I came here, I did some traveling as well. I did some teaching overseas and whatnot. But before I came here, I had about 5 years of teaching in an academic English as a second language program at a community college. So now that you know my background, this is the context that I had before I came here. So this was my understanding of higher education before I came to Russia, and it's quite different. It's quite different, right? So what I noticed, things that stood out for me right away when I came. Students have to know their career goals very early. You know, for the most part, when you are still a high school student, you have to pretty much know. Now, I know that it happens that you can transfer between departments, but it's difficult. And so you kind of have to know early. And I don't know what I think about that. I think it should be probably easier to change your mind, because if I think about myself at the age of 17, 18, I don't know, I'm 35 and I still don't really know what I want to be when I grow up. Right? And when I was 17, oh my goodness. I wanted to be a rock and roll star. Very small groups. I was invited to Pavlovsk recently, well, last year. And I gave the teachers there a choice of presentations I could give. And they wanted managing large classes. They wanted me to talk about managing large classes. And when someone says large classes, I think 40. Right? which is a large class. In fact, in some lower level university courses, not language courses, like mathematics, you can have 120 students in a class. And so I prepare my presentation for managing large classes, and I go to the school and I ask, I say, well, how many is a large class group? And they said, I don't know, 15, 20, like, wow, 20 is like perfect. 20 is like the perfect number for me. And so actually it was an adjustment for me to have to teach small groups, because right now I have a group of 5 students, and I would much prefer 25, to be honest. Because I feel like they have more perpetual motion. You know, I get them going and they just roll with it, whereas with 5 students I feel like I have to work harder to get them to talk and to participate. Another thing I noticed is that the students that I have visited here are extraordinarily talented language learners. I'm continually impressed at the very, very high level of English skills that the students have. It does not happen like that in the United States. Foreign language instruction is not the most important, or is not among the most important courses of study in the U.S. So that continues to impress me. Even after a year and a half. Groups stay together. This was something that I was aware of before I came, because I lived and taught in the former Soviet Union before. I lived in Uzbekistan, I lived in Turkmenistan, but I hadn't really worked at an institution for a long time and gotten to know students as well as I've gotten to know them here. And the groups stay together the whole time, and they become really, really close. They become really, they keep these bonds that they form their entire lives. And this is a new concept for me. Some students were working on a project, and they wanted to borrow some textbooks of mine. And one of their classmates volunteered to deliver my textbook to them. And I was just amazed. Why are you helping your classmate? An American would say, get it yourself. Right? I was really impressed at that, at these bonds, this togetherness that the groups have. Course grades are less important than examinations. This was a really big surprise for me. And that, coming from my perspective, your course grade is everything. Right? But in the system that I'm teaching in now, what's most important for the course is that it prepares you for the examination. So you want to do okay in your coursework, but the most important mark that you receive is in your examination. This was an entirely new concept for me. And it didn't really sink in until, honestly, after my first semester. And my first semester was quite interesting because of this miscommunication. Students tend to have less control over their own education. I know that sometimes students have choices, that they can take different courses, but for the most part, you kind of are with the same group in every course, and everything is kind of determined for you. Pluses and minuses. Coming from my system, I prefer having more choices, but certainly if it works for the students, it works. That was just something that I noticed. Lots and lots of class time. I know it depends on the university. I visited some universities where they told me the students are in class, in the classroom, sometimes 40 hours per week. Now, coming from my context, 1 hour in the classroom equals you must also do 1 hour of homework. Right? And so my poor students at the beginning, I was giving them so much homework. But they all had like sometimes 10 other professors in addition to me that were also giving them homework. And if you're in class 30 hours per week, you can't do 30 hours of homework. It's impossible. And sleep and eat. You can't do it. You can't do it. And so I was giving a lot of homework, and I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on them at first. Critical thinking skills. This is an area that I saw needs some development. Being able to take some new information, combine it, synthesize it, analyze it, and then come to a new conclusion. Not necessarily that the students can't do it, obviously they can. And in certain activities and projects that I did, my students adapted very, very quickly. But generally, projects and activities that required critical thinking were new. And at first, we struggled. Writing and research skills are underdeveloped. Conducting research for academic projects and evaluating sources. Writing as a process. Now, all of my students are really gifted writers. They can write really well. They have really great ideas. But looking at writing as a process of recursive steps from planning to outlining to revising, drafting, etc., this is not necessarily something that they had a lot of strength in. Of course, once I showed them, once I demonstrated, obviously they were extremely talented and they adapted right away. But that was something that was new. Plagiarism is a problem. Now, plagiarism is a problem everywhere. I had some issues with students, and it was confusing to me that they would plagiarize, and then I would show them, here, look where you plagiarized, and then they would do it again. And the problem is not just stealing. It's not just going to Google and cutting and pasting. Oftentimes, plagiarism that I encountered was using sources properly. So if you use text from another source, if you don't tell me where you got it, even if it's in quotation marks, it's plagiarism. If you paraphrase, but you leave a large portion of the phrase intact, like 4 or 5 words in a row from the original, and even though you tell me where you got it, that's plagiarism. And so plagiarism is difficult to avoid. It requires a lot of practice. It also requires effective research skills, which they were lacking in. Of course, once we looked at it, once we practiced it, they adapted very, very quickly. Groups contain a wide variety of skill levels. Hi, come in, sorry. I can have in one group of students, a supremely talented and hardworking student, and maybe another one that's equally hardworking, but is at a much lower skill level. And my guess is maybe this is a result of groups staying together. If you don't, if you're like a weaker student, you don't get held back. But this required a lot of extra planning. I mean, as professional language teachers, we can adapt our lessons for multiple skill levels, but it takes extra work, it takes extra time. And that was a struggle that I had. When students earned low grades, and the way that I see it, if you don't come to class, or if you plagiarize, or if you don't do the work, you receive a poor mark. It's logical, right? But very often students didn't seem to understand why they did so poorly, even when I showed them. And extra work at the end of the semester. So I had, for example, there was a student, really, really talented and smart student, who came to class maybe twice during the semester. I saw him 2 times. And then in December, he shows up and he says, I need extra work so that I can get zachot, right? And I said, what do you mean extra work? I don't understand. He said, well, I was absent. And I said, yeah, you were absent a lot. In fact, what's your name? I had seen him so rarely. Really smart, really talented. And he wanted to make up for the work that he had missed. And I thought, well, why should I do extra work because you were lazy? Right? And besides, it's December, Christmas is coming, I'm doing my shopping. I don't want to grade extra work just because you didn't want to come to class in October. And so I told him, well, you can build a time machine, you can go back to September and come to class every Monday. Right? But the problem was mine as well, because I didn't know that he had that expectation. He thought in September, and in December he could come to me. Right? But I didn't know that. And I know that a lot of professors do that, and a lot of professors are okay with that, but I'm not okay with it. And I should have told him at the beginning, no extra work. Or I should have laid out a specific plan for extra work, which I actually did later. Teachers are generally overworked. Teachers work a lot. Teachers have very little time to do some of the extra things, like coming to conferences. Right? I'm so glad that you're all here. But in St. Petersburg, if I'm not mistaken, there are thousands of English teachers. Right? There are a lot of people here, but there are a lot of people who are not here. And I think we know why, because they're busy. They're overworked. They're tired. It's Saturday. Right? Teachers have a lot of work. And so extra time for planning lessons, for reading and writing on students' essays and such. A lot of this work is that they can't do it because they have so many classes. So here's what I did. After the first semester, when we had this miscommunication, I decided to more closely involve my students in the grading process. And so I was fortunate that I was able to decide on my scoring rubric myself. So like 20% for attendance, 20% for participation. It was my choice. So at the beginning of the semester, what I do now is actually I ask my students, okay, we have 5 types of grade. You have your homework and your quizzes, and you have your major assignments and your participation. Let's together assign the percentage for each. And they were involved in the process, which meant they were invested in the process, and they understood it more, and they bought into it. This giving evaluations is something that most American professors are required to do. And so in my first semester, I didn't do it. But in my second semester, I decided maybe I should ask my students to evaluate me. So at the end of the semester, before they receive their marks, right, before they receive their final marks, you ask them to anonymously grade the course, give their evaluation of you. What did they like? What did they not like? And of course, they don't put their names on it. And you would be amazed what you find out. I learned so much about different expectations that we had that weren't shared, simply because they didn't know that I didn't know, and I didn't know that they didn't know. Regarding extra work, after my first debacle of the first semester, I decided, okay, at the beginning of the semester, in February, I will tell you, you can do extra work. This is how much it counts. It will count 10% towards your final grade. You can submit it any time during the semester before, like 2 weeks or something before the end of the semester. So students can do extra work, but there are limits to it. I used a website, and if you're curious, I can share it with you, where I gave assignments and students submitted homework, but also I was able to put their grades for all of their assignments on the website so they can check it anytime. So after every class, I would go to the website and I would put their participation grade and I would put their homework grade, and it would average automatically so the students could see their progress, so that in May or in December, there were no surprises. Homework. Pretty clear, right? I focused on writing and research, even in my conversation classes, English conversation classes. Even if it's not a writing course, I think we all kind of agree that if we can integrate the 4 skills in every lesson, so even if it's a speaking course, a speaking lesson, some writing, some reading, etc. is required. So all of my students did writing. All of my students did research in every class, no matter what they were studying, no matter what the focus was. I did not tolerate plagiarism, and students adapted very quickly. They adapted very quickly. And I made my practices known and available to my colleagues. I think this was one of the most beneficial parts of what I was doing, because I was new, and they didn't really know how I was working, and they didn't really know what kinds of expectations I had. I have a different approach, and I felt like there's a lot that we can learn from each other. And so I made sure that they were always invited into my lessons. I made sure that they always knew that I was available to share my practices. Oh, and that's all. This is my website, if you don't know already, and my email address. If you want to copy this presentation, I can send it to you. I haven't put one on my website yet, but I will. If you are not a member of the ELT Russia Ning, if you don't know what it is, you should find out. Go to this website. It is a social networking site for teachers of English in the Russian Federation. There are about 700 members right now. It's a place for you to share ideas, participate in discussions. Right now, in the month of May, there's a weekly discussion being run by Russian teachers on teaching writing in the English language classroom. Some of the moderators are actually in this room right now. And then, of course, if you're not familiar with this website for the English Language Office, you can go there, download an enormous amount of materials for teacher development and for students as well. If you have questions, I will have a table in the mentoring session. You can come to me then, and I will answer your questions at that time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.